where the courts can go, where we would want them to go.
I got a note that the meeting is now live streaming on YouTube, so maybe we need to.
Yep, y'all are good for the next couple of seconds. But we are sorry. I feel like this is generally unbecoming of me. You know what, y'all? It has been
Shama's going crazy over here.
I know.
I am sending the YouTube live link to our digital director. I'm going to take us off video.
No, I'm introducing them, so we don't want to go on video.
We are going back on video.
Y'all need to come down there with some donuts or something.
I've had a bourbon already, so I'm good.
Oh, okay. You're
Not enough bourbon.
You tell me when we're live.
Again, missing out.
All right, guys, we're live. Thanks again for everybody, for all of our delegates for sticking through. Thanks, Congresswoman, Women Loria, Spamberger, and Wexton and Corinne for the last panel. Really appreciate all the work that you're doing for us in Washington. We wanted to end today on a really important conversation, particularly now, that's facing our country, which is criminal justice reform. And I think that it's a fitting way to end our first ever day of first ever virtual convention. And we have some really heavy hitters who I'm proud and excited that they're joining us today. With Attorney General Mark Herring, our first woman African-American majority leader, Charnel Herring, Congressman Bobby Scott, the dean of our congressional delegation, and then the powerful and dynamic delegate Jennifer Carroll Foy, and also Shannon Taylor, who I think Virginia is going to get to know a little bit better. We certainly know her at the party and in Henrico County for being just a dynamite Commonwealth's attorney. And so I'm going to kick it over to you, Shannon. I'm going to go off video here and let you take it away. But thanks everybody for joining us and have a good discussion.
Great, thank you. So thank you, Andrew, and good evening to everybody who's watching. I couldn't agree more about how important criminal justice reform is, and I think that this panel is spectacular as we have our federal representation with Congressman Scott, and of course with Attorney General Herring as he's watching, and then of course with having Majority Leader Herring, who is the chair of House Courts, and then of course with Delegate Carol Foy and all the great bills that she has been proposing for criminal justice reform. But I think Andrew's right when we talk about what's happening now, and we know all the good work that we did with the Assembly earlier this year, and all these good bills that are going to be coming to life, so to speak, on July 1st. But now we have a new movement that we've been seeing with the protests. And just to kind of start off generally, what is about this moment, about the protests that we're seeing nationwide, and particularly here in the capital of Virginia, about why do we think it's this moment that is making this the tipping point, so to speak? And Congressman Scott, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you, Shannon. It's a pleasure to join this discussion. It's interesting that there are a lot of moments where you think there's a change. We thought there was a change in gun safety after Newtown, when elementary school children saw their bodies riddled with assault weapon bullets. Nothing. So hopefully this change, where there appears to be a significant reaction to a police officer kneeling on someone's neck for 8 minutes, 40-some seconds, and George Floyd just had life going out of him, saying, "I can't breathe." And the officer, knowing he's being videotaped, is just devoid of any reaction, as if he's going to get away with it. The others are standing watching. So I think the public, seeing it on video, hopefully has just come to the last straw. The House has already taken appropriate action by developing legislation that's been considered in a hearing and markup in the Judiciary Committee. We believe, well, there are enough co-sponsors on the bill to pass the bill if people just show up. And the legislation creates a prohibition against chokeholds and no-knock warrants. It creates national standards for for policing, a lot of data collection, but most of all, it holds police officers accountable for their actions. The reaction from the Republican side was that we need to do something, and so they've offered legislation not nearly sufficient. But the fact that they have not criticized the Democratic bill and are offering something on their own shows that they feel compelled in this situation to react. The polling has gone off the chart. The polling on behalf of doing something to correct the situation has gone into the 60s, 70s, and 80%. So I think the times have changed, and Congress will give the opportunity to do something about it. And the legislation, I think, will make a profound difference.
Yeah, and so Majority Leader Herring, I grew up in Charlottesville, so when we saw the Unite the Right rally there, and we saw the movement there, you've been in the General Assembly for a while, and you've seen these events just like Congressman Scott has been talking about. So what do you see about this movement as you're giving vision moving forward for our special session and then, of course, for session next year?
Absolutely, and thank you so much. And I think Congressman Scott hit it right on the head. I think the difference this time is that we have a positioning of everything sort of coming together. And unfortunately, is with Mr. Floyd's death, where the nation saw, and actually the world, this police officer's knee on someone's neck. African Americans have been talking about police brutality for a very long time. African Americans have been talking about mass incarceration. We have been talking about all these issues, but finally everyone is like sort of seeing what we are talking about. And what's key is in this moment to move. I mean, there is definitely a cry for help. People want action, but then what we are challenged in fulfilling some of it is that a lot of the infrastructure that was in place for like parole has been diminished by the Allen administration and on with administrations who believe that the appropriate way for criminal justice is to lock them up and enhance penalties and mandatory minimums, which most people disagree with, and that we've got to get rid of that. But I do think the moment is now, and even those on the other side of the aisle, at least talking about police reform, our challenge is going to be, but I think we're going to be able to do it, is have criminal justice reform.
And Delegate Carol Foy, I mean, you are out there right now for all the good reasons that you're out there, and so you're engaging with citizens right now. So how can we take that energy that we have right now and turn that into real results and keep people engaged and keep them hopeful? Because we always talk about, don't let the protesters leave, and then 2 weeks from now, are we looking at each other? So how can we do that?
Yeah, so thank you for that. One of the ways that we do this, I'm happy that people are protesting peacefully with a purpose, but then what happens after the fact? And for me, my protest will be through passing the policies that we need to address the systemic and historical inequities in our healthcare system, education, our environment, and our economy. So that's what I look forward to doing, because that's what people really want. People know that we have two types of criminal justice systems here in Virginia. And as the first public defender ever elected to the Virginia General Assembly, I see it every day. I walk with it into the courtroom. I have to make arguments on its behalf. I have to explain to so many children and people who are under 100% below the poverty line with mental illness and substance abuse why the system isn't working for them, why they don't get a second chance. What does that mean when Virginia has 3-strike laws and mandatory minimums, these archaic and draconian ways to really address crime that makes none of us safer? And to know that as an attorney and as a public court-appointed attorney, I can fight against bad laws, but as a delegate, I can work to pass good ones. And that's exactly what I'm leading the charge to do. So it's about police reform. It's about ensuring that we are funding mental health services and diversion programs and second chance programs here in the Commonwealth, and really put our money where our mouth is, which is about rehabilitation and restorative justice and not just retribution. And so entering that tough on crime narrative and really helping communities of that have been historically left behind, I mean, that's the charge that we all have. And so it's absolutely by having a seat at the table and passing policies that improve the quality of life and promote equity throughout our systems.
Yeah. So, Attorney General Herring, you obviously were just in court this past week, looking at, something antiquated, a law there. And what we're talking, and it's the Lee Monument, and it is kind of the epicenter of where these protesters are gathering. And I think that we are seeing that a lot of the protesters are targeting really the local government and then our state governments to take action. So what do you see as being, the general for the entire Commonwealth? What do you see is the ability to change some of the goals of criminal justice reform?
Well, thank you, Shannon, and I'm really glad to be a part of this panel. And I'd like to say hello to everybody who's watching. What we're seeing right now is a national reckoning with police brutality against Black people in this country, and the systemic failures that cause and allow this misconduct to be perpetuated. And this national reckoning gives us an opportunity to really make some advances that are long, long overdue, and to recognize that this stems from a century of law enforcement being used to enforce Jim Crow laws, to enforce segregation, to break up civil rights demonstrations, and be a part of mass incarceration. And I think a lot of the response from the policy side and from those of us who are in positions of leadership is to do it, is to be bold. Yes, we need to make important police reforms, but we also need to think and reimagine what our public safety goals are and how we accomplish those goals, and also realign funding to be, in alignment with that. If you think about all the different ways people call, or reasons people call 911, we have over criminalized too many things, which is one reason why last year I renewed the call for not just decriminalization of marijuana, but legal and regulated adult use, because that was an entry ramp into the criminal justice system that led to opportunities being cut off. There are people in the community who can respond to someone who is having a mental health crisis and do so much better than law enforcement. There's no reason why where a child who may have been at home the night before and observed some domestic abuse and acts out in school, and then gets referred to a school resource officer or to police, and then into the criminal justice system. So we really need to rethink, in addition to going on a parallel track with police reforms, but to also think boldly about really how we go about accomplishing our public safety goals and aligning funding to go along with that.
Yeah, and Congressman Scott, to that point, I know that you're heading up the Criminal Justice Task Force. I think we were calling it the Biden-Bernie Criminal Task Force. But to that end, we hear about what had happened, many years ago with the militarization of our law enforcement. The defense had spent all this money; they couldn't use all their goodies, so they allowed local law enforcement to kind of take on what they couldn't use. So how can the federal government help with the kind of demilitarization of law enforcement and putting in some of these other kind of approaches that Attorney General Herring's talked about? Oh, and you're mute. I got it. Yeah.
Sorry. The first thing we can do is to stop giving local police forces tanks, bazookas, and other military equipment. If a situation presents where you need a tank, then you call out the National Guard. You don't have the local police try to drive tanks up and down the street. But basically, on criminal justice, we have a choice in criminal justice. We can follow the evidence and reduce crime and save money, or we can codify slogans and sound bites, help politicians get elected, but all we're doing is wasting money and loading up the prisons. Unfortunately, for decades, that's the slogans and sound bites carried the day. And there is now a willingness to switch, as the Attorney General has mentioned, to the investments in prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation, which have been shown to be able to significantly reduce crime and save money, and away from the wasteful slogans and sound bites. And that's what we need to put our money in. Vice President Biden has agreed to that. He's on public record supporting the Safe Justice Act that I introduced several years ago, which has a lot of money for prevention, police training, bail reform, drug courts, eliminating mandatory minimums in prisons, prison services, second chance services, to make sure that we're doing what we can to actually reduce crime, and all of those will save money. And the money you saved, as the Attorney General has mentioned, can be reinvested into the community to make sure that the community has the social supports, the education, the housing, the healthcare that make for a healthy community, and by the way, less crime. And that's the approach we're going in. I think there's a clear consensus, at least in the Biden-Sanders task force on criminal justice. There is a consensus that that's where we want to put our money.
Hey, Shannon, could I add something to what the Congressman just said? Since I have his ear right now, one of the things that I think has been added to the large criminal justice reform bill that's in Congress right now is giving state attorneys general the authority to do pattern of practice investigations of police departments where there are suspected misconduct, and that there is a system that needs to be changed and rectified. The reason that I joined with my other attorney general colleagues in asking for that authority is because the Trump administration has totally abdicated its responsibility there. Now, of course, we've seen Donald Trump actually continue to make things worse by calling on police to even use more force than they already have the last couple of weeks. We've seen how his security, using riot police to push peaceful demonstrators away so we could have a photo op. But his Department of Justice has totally abandoned an important tool that we thought we could count on the federal government to exercise fairly to help stop unconstitutional policing, where there are a significant number of instances coming from a particular department to go in and investigate it. So we have asked for that authority. I think it is now in the bill that's in front of the House of Representatives. I don't have a whole lot of confidence in McConnell's Senate, but I'm hopeful that even if we don't get that in the end, that maybe in the special session that's upcoming, or I hope will be upcoming, the General Assembly will be able to give my office and my team that same authority. That's been an important tool to help check police brutality and excessive force in cities across the country, from Baltimore to Los Angeles and Chicago and other places.
Well, the Trump administration hadn't only abandoned that practice, they've gone backwards. There have been some consent decrees that they pulled out of. And so when the progress has been made and the city agrees to a consent decree to take certain actions, they've actually pulled away from those. But to a large extent, and this is a political convention, to a large extent, the vote will make the difference, because the people you put into office will be making the decisions. And I give one example is Keith Ellison, who used to be a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, ran for and was elected Attorney General of Minnesota in a close election. A few days after the George Floyd case, the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, took over the prosecution. And after he took it over, the charges of the police officer went up, the other three were arrested. You wonder what would have happened if he had lost that close election. And so we need to make sure we have Commonwealth attorneys, Shannon, that we can count on doing the right thing. City councils, they'll count on hiring the right people as police officers. There's a lot of this, the police officers didn't fall out of the sky and into uniform. They were appointed the chief of police through the political process and are controlled by the political process. And so we need to make sure that as we have these protests, that somebody's out there with a clipboard getting people registered to vote, because that's going to ultimately make the difference.
There, people are taking advantage of that because I've actually seen it happen. And so, Majority Leader Herring, that is what we're talking about in terms of kind of effectuating this change on that local level. There's a state agency that oversees each of the local law enforcement agencies to make sure that they are accredited, et cetera. And when we're hearing proposals like what Delegate Carol Foy has talked about, and what Congressman Scott talking about, banning the chokeholds, changing the way of policing. How, as the majority leader, can you offer us some kind of maybe roadmap or your vision as to how we can get our local law enforcement agencies to change when sometimes the change is based on the finances? So, for example, the body-worn cameras that are not implemented with every law enforcement agency.
Exactly. And I'll start with the body cameras. It's incumbent upon us. I mean, we can, in the General Assembly, require it. The Department of Criminal Justice Services, I will say, in my view, has been severely underfunded. There was a point, I recall, that I remember that was one person responsible for the continuing education of our law enforcement officers. I have put in a bill for several years on training on de-escalation, community policing, dealing with people with disabilities, and it kept being put off. So I'm dusting off that bill and reintroducing it because, we have to think about priorities. And, I see law enforcement as sort of the protectors of our constitutional rights. That's what they should be, not violators. And I think that is important, that we invest in training, invest in the body cameras, and do what we can to make sure that the completion of their duties or their service is to the best and the highest level possible. The other thing is, I serve on the State Crime Commission. We will be starting to decide what we're going to study. We're going to convene a meeting on July 1, more than likely, and we're going to start that process. And so I think we're going to see, again, significant changes, but we're going to have to, as legislators from both sides of the aisle, there has to be a will to do this. And I think there is, but we've got to deliver this time.
And Delegate Carol Foy, I was going to ask you, we see in Fairfax where they have, almost 800 officers. They had given 300 and plus some the body-worn cameras, and then they had this incident that occurred where the officer has been charged. Now they're talking about putting more body-worn cameras out there. So when you are, what are you seeing with some of these local law enforcement agencies that you would also suggest that they need to change and to make things? Would you propose some more uniformity with the actions that some of our agencies are taking?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. Well, first, I would like to acknowledge all of the progress that we have been making under our new Courts of Justice Chair, Delegate Charnel Herring, and Majority Leader. And because of this new majority that we've been able to take, we've been able to do things like pass a bill to address police accountability. And so that way, every officer who stops someone, they have to take down their demographic information, their race, their gender, all of that information, so we can collect it and find out, is there an issue here where Latinx community or African Americans are being pulled over at disparate numbers, and how do we really address that? Because you have to have the evidence in order to make evidence-based decisions. We've been able to, as Delegate Charnel Herring championed, was the decriminalization of marijuana. There are a lot of inroads that we've been making, but we can do more. And so what I say and what I would do is be bold and progressive. And so, for example, it's not only about accountability, such as body cams, but it's about prevention. So we could talk about accountability with the body cams, but the crime has already been committed. When we talk about prevention, we could do things in police reform, such as officers do not have to fill out on their application whether or not they are a part of a race-based hate group. That might be something to know. Also, making sure that we have real active shooting training, excessive force training in a real substantial way, and not just implicit bias training, but let's call it what it is, an actual bias training, because there has been a real demonization, criminalization, and weaponization of Black and brown skin, which has led to a lot of the excessive force that's used, the pulling of the weapons when it's unwarranted, and seeing brown and Black people as threats when they otherwise are not. And so those are the ways that you really address the underlying issues. So it's not just about accountability, but it's about prevention also. And those are the things that I would implement.
Yeah, so sometimes I think that the Commonwealth of Virginia has done, maybe I'm not going to use the word disservice, but we are 120 localities within our structure. And so Attorney General Herring, when you are talking about speaking with your Democratic colleagues throughout the United States and the other, I guess we have 24 Democratic Attorney Generals, but for example, we saw the law enforcement integrity bill that was proposed in Colorado. When you are looking at, and I should also mention, and what Congressman Scott was talking about with Attorney General Ellison, the governor giving him the ability to head up that investigation with George Floyd. What is the dialogue that you all are sharing, and what sort of ideas do you see from speaking with your colleagues that we can take from that state level moving forward? Oh, you're muted.
I think in talking about what a difference it can make to have an attorney general like Keith Ellison, who has the perspective that he has and that we have, can really make a difference. And that's really what we're talking about, is how we can use the platform that we've been given and the credibility that comes with the job to really make sure that people have confidence in systems that are in place. Certainly we want to do what we can to reform police and address excessive force and brutality and those issues. But we also, on the back end, need to make sure that we have a system that people have confidence in if, God forbid, there is a situation that needs to be investigated. And I know that there are investigators who can handle those independently, but it's important to have that outside of the department itself, because people need to know that it's not the police investigating their own members or people who work closely together every day. Somebody from the outside who can come in and independently investigate a police-involved shooting or an allegation of excessive force or brutality or a pattern or practice in a system that needs to be broken down, because otherwise the public's not going to have confidence in that. So it's looking at the different places in which we can really give people the confidence to know that those systems of transparency and accountability can be implemented and work better. Because right now, what we're seeing out right now is that people a lot of people have lost trust in law enforcement. Right. People don't have the trust in investigations when a department investigates a member of its own department for excessive force. So those are some important ways that we can change in Virginia. There's some localities that have established citizen review boards. There needs to be a system of oversight that is transparent, that people have confidence in, that can work.
Yeah, Congressman Scott, we know that at least with the FBI, there is a civil rights division in DOJ. And to that point, they have a role. So it's not just what Attorney General Herring's been talking about with the excessive force that we can do on the local level and come with attorneys, actually putting forth criminal charges against law enforcement who have exceeded their lawful protection, so to speak. So where do you see the Department of Justice in this? Because the FBI with civil rights, that is also important.
Well, they have investigatory powers that in other administrations they've used. They've come in on pattern of practice investigations and have come to agreement with the local police department and agreed to consent decrees. This administration came in, as I indicated, not only not pursuing new pattern and practice cases, they're withdrawing from consent decrees that they already had. So I think the fact of the matter is we're just not expecting much from this administration for the rest of this term, and we'll deal with that in November. There is one thing that I think is crucial for people to do if they want better policing, and that is to make sure people from the community join the police department.
Right.
When you have people from the outside doing the policing, you're always going to have problems. You want people, not just a residency requirement. That's good, but people who went to high school in the area, people that know people and people know them, people that grow up, people that go to church in the area, belong to civic organizations, so that they're part of the community. And when you have a police force with nobody really from the community, you're going to have problems. So ministers and other civic organizations need to be identifying young people that would make good police officers and encourage them and support them to join the force. Now, the nature of things, people don't want to join. So maybe you have to increase the pay, increase the training, increase the education requirements. But we need to encourage people from the community to join the police force, so that when you take out your weapon and aim it at somebody, your thought ought to come to your mind, that could be Miss Mabel's nephew, that could be lawyer so-and-so's grandson, that person may go to First Baptist Church. If all you know about them is somebody, you don't know who their friends are, who their relatives are, and you won't see them again, you have a different attitude. So we need to make sure that people join the force in a part of the community. And when you have a critical mass of people from the community, you'll have a different reaction.
Yeah, I think we saw that change happen in Camden, New Jersey, where they literally restructured their police department. They made certain changes like you've been talking about, where they changed the civil exam, whatever we call that, and we're doing more of that reaching into the neighborhood, and have completely revamped to a huge success for that change. So Majority Leader Herring, we've heard some reference about whether or not we can work with the Republicans in Congress. And I think Attorney General Harris like talking about Senator McConnell not feeling a lot of success there. But going into the special session, and you've already experienced the luxury of the win this past January. So what is it going to look like moving forward when we hear the statistics like Congressman Scott talked about what people want in terms of reform? So what does that look like working with the other side, so to speak?
Right. Look, I hope that we get their buy-in, and the reason is that I like longevity of policy. We have the numbers to pass what we would like to pass and get done, I think. But what is key for longevity is to have, it would be nice to have bipartisan support. But I will say this: we are bold. We're going to move forward because we know that criminal justice reform is good, and it's certainly needed. That we have our laws is systematically racist. I'll just put it that way. It really is, and especially with mandatory minimums, and it's got to change. And the people who elected us, a lot of our delegates in the House ran on that, and we have to deliver. So there is certainly a will in the House that we deliver, and that's what we're going to do. And we would certainly welcome the company of those on the other side of the aisle with us as we do.
And Delegate Carol Foy, you've talked about how you've been able to work with your Republican colleagues in getting certain, bills through. So do you also kind of have a vision of what that looks like?
I do.
Then?
Yeah. So I do. One of the things I'm most proud of is my ability to pass a number of bills in a bipartisan fashion. And so whether it's expanding broadband to rural and Southwest Virginia, or expanding career and technical education, expanding small businesses for veterans, I mean, a number of things, even in criminal justice reform, opening a public defender's office in Prince William County, which is a majority minority county, and ensuring that they have competent, qualified representation for people who need it the most. So I think we can do it. I think there are some people who are willing to be open to get things done. And so where there's a will, there's a way. And I'm willing to work with anyone who's willing to work with me in order to move Virginia forward. And if not, that's the great thing about having the majority. I mean, the people have spoken and they've chosen their representatives, and it's our job to lead and to ensure that we do things reasonably and responsibly, which I think we've been very successful at. We had a historic session and moved the ball forward on a number of issues, whether it's access to the ballot, reproductive health care, common sense gun safety legislation. And I foresee us doing even more. So it's all of our jobs to protect the majority, to ensure we're able to lead in a great fashion, but also making sure that we reach out on the other side of the aisle to get things done in a bipartisan fashion as much as we possibly can.
Excellent. So as we're getting towards the end of this session, I want to ask a question. I would like for all of you all to make a comment about this, because again, I think that we have to recognize this moment that we're involved in, that we are living, which is, again, these protesters, these people who are feeling so passionate about the change, and whether it's the peaceful protesters or some of the stuff that we've been seeing in the city of Richmond. So I would like for all of you, and I'll start with Congressman Scott, what is the best way for protesters to make their voices heard, to influence you? Like what is really impactful to you when they are trying to have their voices heard?
Well, the first thing they can do is register to vote, because that makes a difference. We talked about body cameras a little while ago. Some policemen are kind of casual about turning them on. There was a shooting in Louisville, Kentucky, where they did not have their body cameras on. The mayor fired the chief of police.
Mm-hmm.
I think that'll be the last time they'll take a cavalier attitude about using body cameras. I mean, these are political decisions, and the political system really can crack down on that kind of thing. But we've heard the term defund the police. Gives you an idea of how bad the situation is. A lot of people would rather have no police than these police, but it also indicates that there are investments that we ought to be making. Several years ago, I introduced the Youth Promise Act, which I finally got passed as part of the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act and an Every Student Succeeds Act, but this administration won't move on it, so we have to wait until Joe Biden comes in to get some action. But it requires an assessment in high crime areas about how bad the situation is, how much money you're spending on incarceration and other social pathology, and come up with a evidence-based plan, comprehensive, to do something about it. Just this past session, Delegate Marcia Price got legislation passed to designate 5 jurisdictions to start that process of evaluation. Get the community together, do the evaluation. People will be shocked in high crime areas how much money we're spending to support people being incarcerated from a high crime area. In some states, the average African American incarceration rate would show they're wasting, that is, over and above when anybody thinks you're getting any criminal justice value, wasting $50 to $100 million in an area of 100,000 people. Well, if you're going to cut the crime rate in half, that gives you an idea of how much you ought to be spending. But come up with a comprehensive plan, we'll fund it, and then you got to capture the savings, because you're going to save a lot of money to keep the programs going. those kinds of programs, the housing and healthcare and after-school programs and summer programs, the kinds of investments in a community that make it healthy and will bring down the crime rate. But we have to make those investments. And I don't want to wait until you can squeeze some money out of the police department to make the investments. We ought to just make the investments to begin with. And so that's one of the things that I'm looking forward to in the Biden administration, to make investments like that in communities for prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation, and not wait for crime to occur.
And Attorney General Herring?
You know, one of the things that I've been really impressed with is that the demonstrators that are out on the streets and demanding change, they're making their voices heard. And you cannot stand on Lee Circle and Monument Avenue and not just experience the feeling of a coalition that will not stand for the status quo any longer. And you can just stand there and feel it. The demonstrations that I've seen, whether it's been in Richmond or in my hometown in Leesburg or seen on video, they are multi-generational, multiracial, multi-ethnic. You know, this is a wide, diverse awakening that people are not going to stand for the status quo anymore. So they are making their voices heard. We want to keep them engaged, and we need them to stay engaged. And one of the ways that we can do that is by taking bold action. You know, that is one thing that I have seen in the last 6.5 years I've been Attorney General, from when I said, no, we're not going to go in and defend a discriminatory ban on marriage. We're going to fight for marriage equality. And I said, no, we're going to stand up for Virginia Dreamers, for our environment, call for criminal justice reform. And you know what? Virginians responded, and they will support you when you take bold stands on their behalf. And then another thing that's really important is we had 2 really big Supreme Court wins this week. One on LGBT rights, and something that I've been fighting for years to make sure that they had protections in the workplace, and also with DACA. And one of the things that made those efforts so successful is that there were diverse viewpoints, people who are willing to stand up, demand their rights, demand that people recognize what's right, and to also share their stories. So as this moves along, we're going to need people of diverse viewpoints who are willing to stand up and say, you know, what's been happening to them, what they've been feeling, and that needs to continue. And then I'll just reinforce something that Congressman Scott said earlier, because this is a convention. The other thing is get out and vote and work hard. We need to reelect our great Senator Mark Warner, elect all our Democratic congressmen and women and add to their numbers. And we need to remove the criminal enterprise that is in the White House right now and make sure Joe Biden wins.
Exactly, exactly. Majority Leader Herring, with the protesters and making sure that they are being heard. Oh, you're on mute. Okay.
There we go. Yes, and I agree with Attorney General Herring. They are certainly being heard. But what's important, like Congressman Scott said, vote, 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 vote. Not just the presidential. Vote in the state elections. Vote on your local elections, because that's what's going to make a difference. Also, continue to write your legislators. I will tell you, and I share this story briefly. There was a group of family members and mothers mostly who had sons who were incarcerated. They made a difference in Virginia here when we review our judges. Their concern was departing from the sentencing guidelines and not having it written down anywhere as the law requires. Now, when those judges are up for review, that is part of their review. We are looking at that. They made a difference, and their advocacy is so key. And they were advocating when criminal justice reform was not talked about much. People didn't, would shy away from it. They were there, and I have great respect for them because they made an impact. Everybody can make an impact. Continue to write the letters. I know I love those handwritten letters for people, because that is from the heart, and I know that they are talking about something that's probably more unlikely affecting someone in their family, and making suggestions that ultimately we legislators turn into law. So keep it going. Thank you.
And Delegate Carfoy, I bet you've been walking in those marches. So again, you know, when we see what our protesters are doing, the peaceable part of it, and then there, you know, the other ways that are expressing themselves, what do you think is the most effective?
Absolutely. So I think the most effective thing to do is to continue to make your voice heard. And when we move in a concerted effort, our voices ring louder. And so I have been participating in some of the peaceful protests, and I started off as an advocate. So I understand exactly where the frustration and the anger and the want to make things happen and for legislators to move come from. And so I like to take it back to, you know, just that advocate meeting the legislative piece. And I'll never forget trying to convince, you know, people and legislators to do what's right, to stand for what's right, to vote the right way. And, you know, I'll use, for example, the Equal Rights Amendment, when I looked at, you know, my Republican counterparts and said, we can disagree upon a lot of things, but my equality and my fundamental right as a human being equal to men is not one of them. And it's very simple that if I can't change your mind on women's equality, then I will change your seat. And then making good on that promise by helping other candidates running for office so we can shore up the majority, so we can pass progressive and bold legislation. And that's why you've seen the sea change. Because when we decide what is important, and again, when we galvanize and we come together and we make our voices heard, people are in the seats that they're in because we allowed them to be there. And we can't ever forget that. We have to hold people's feet to the fire and ensure that people are voting the right way for democratic values and agendas. So if you want real systemic criminal justice reform, if you want real police reform, if you want real funding into our diversion programs and into mental health in a real systemic way, and actually dismantling our segregated school systems here in Virginia and finally funding it the way that it should be, well, we all have a job to do. And that means we have to register to vote. We have to get behind candidates who are running, who are for our values and who are principled and who will be bold and progressive. And we have to ensure that we support them in real substantive ways. And of course, we have to show up at the ballot box, because there's only one place where, you know, the president of Amazon, you know, and a person who sweeps the floor, where they are absolutely equal and they are both just as powerful. And that is at the voting booth. So let's all remember that, and let's keep up the work.
Exactly. And the last comment, you know, Congressman Scott, you talked about how Delegate Price is doing her project with the 5 localities to get data. And we also know that we have, and I hope I'm saying this the right way, Majority Leader Herring, the new bill that is the Virginia, it's something about data, where we're having our police agencies, and it's strictly, it is focusing on the bias and to an extent the excessive force, where we are going to have law enforcement agencies collecting data about when they're pulling somebody over, why they're pulling somebody over, and what is happening from there. And I don't know if you want to kind of offer a little bit about you know, what was behind that bill. And then we know there's going to be a report that gets generated that not only goes to you, it's going to go to Attorney General Herring and the governor, and actually to Commonwealth attorneys as well. So that data is going to be critical moving forward.
No, absolutely. And that data will help us shape policy and what's needed. That bill was actually carried by Delegate Luke Torian out of Prince William, and it is a crucial piece of legislation. And every time when we talk about evidence-based policy, you know, this is what we're talking about. We'll have the data and we'll know how to take corrective measures. Or maybe, hopefully, there won't be much, but if there are, we'll at least know what it is that we're dealing with. So again, so very critical, and that's good policy making.
Right.
That is good. It's evidence-based, and that's the way that Democrats govern.
Shannon, there's significant data collection in the federal bill that's pending right now. Use of force, the demographics, so you can see exactly what's going on. I hope they collect the data if the bill passes, because we've been disappointed in the fact that they haven't bothered to collect the deaths in custody. in custody in jails and prisons or in the process of arrest. They've just ignored the law that requires them to do it. It passed in 2000. It was renewed in 2014. It expired, but was renewed in 2014 after Michael Brown's death in Ferguson, Missouri. But the administration has refused to implement the program to do the administration of counting the people that die in custody. That would give you the demographic data. That'll give you a little pattern of what's going on, so that once you see what the patterns are, you can see what preventive action could be taken. But they have refused, and we've about every 6 months for the last 3.5 years, we've written this administration telling them that what the law is and what they are supposed to be collecting, and they just won't do it. But again, we'll fix that in November, and we'll have the data collected, and even more data under the Justice and Policing Act.
Yes, and what I'd just like to recognize here as we're closing out, you know, again, I want to applaud and thank our leaders, with Majority Leader Herring and of course with Delegate Carol Foy, when you were offering up your criminal justice reform bills that came through the General Assembly this past year, that again will be coming in July 1st. And so now I think we're taking our focus from the actual crimes now to the enforcement part. And not only are we talking about kind of, I don't want to use the word new normal anymore, because it is the way things are going to be. It is normal. And we are looking at the way we want to have our community caretakers act in our jurisdictions. But there's the other component, which is, you know, that's yours truly, and it is your Commonwealth attorneys who are there to also be responsible for engaging with the community and making sure that people's rights are protected. You know, I hear a lot of my colleagues talk about, you know, that we're here to serve justice. Well, we're here to protect the Constitution, and that is first and foremost. And that means we have a responsibility to make sure that the police are not violating that Constitution when they are engaging with individuals. And, you know, we are responsible for making sure that, as we were talking about, this allocation of funds and really putting our money where it could be used better for change, which is in our social services, in our education, making sure we've got the housing that are affordable for everybody. And I think that we see that. And I can tell you that you have my word that I will be working with my colleagues, particularly some of your new Commonwealth attorneys up there in Northern Virginia. And of course, in Central Virginia with some of my friends in Charlottesville, Albemarle, of course, down in Tidewater with Stephanie Morales and Greg Underwood. You have our commitment that we are going to be part of that change, and we are going to be part of the supportive movement going forward. So again, I'm going to be deferential to the congressman. We've talked a lot about making sure we get out that vote, and we want people to be engaged. And this is the convention, is the cheerleading marquee part of this. So do you have any final words to send off this group this evening?
Yes, elections have consequences, and there'll be major consequences coming from November, not only in criminal justice reform and policing, but in healthcare, social services, voting rights, and everything else. We need to make sure we get out and vote, re-elect Mark Warner, the congressional delegation, and others down ballot, and make sure the next year we come back and strengthen our majorities in the General Assembly. You saw the difference in this session, what difference elections can make. So let's do it again in November.
Absolutely. So Congressman Scott, thank you so much. We love your backdrop there with that full moon. Attorney General Herring, it's great to see you, and thank you for everything that you've been doing. Again, Majority Leader Herring, you've done a fantastic job, and we look forward to your continued leadership as we go through our special session and get ready for next year. And my friend, Delegate Jennifer Carroll Foy, always a pleasure to see you, and looking forward to seeing the bills you're going to be proposing. And so, Andrew, I think we've gotten to the end of this great session, and just want to say personally, thank you so much for letting me participate on this great panel.
What an awesome conversation, and a very fitting way to end our first day of our very first ever virtual convention. Thank you all so much for joining and being a part of this. To the delegation, appreciate you sticking with us through a few technical difficulties, but I'll tell you what, Susan and I came back to the office and we're ready to cheers everybody. And so if you all have any questions about tomorrow's programming, you can feel free to email us at political@vademocrats.org. Otherwise, we are adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow, where we will conduct the business portion of our convention. And so I'm looking forward to doing that with all of you. Thanks again for everybody here who's participated and everybody who has participated in previous panels. We would not be where we are without you guys. So thanks again.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.